Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm so thrilled to welcome you to our conversation tonight with Matthew Goodman, the author of The City Game. We've been waiting for this for a long time at Port Jewish Center. Our friend Jerry Federline came to our book club and said, we have to read this book. We must read this book. It's amazing. I love it. We must read it. And I have to admit, I said, okay, sure, I'm sure it's terrific. But then one after the other, we started reading it and everyone said, oh, I just read it. You're right. It was amazing. We have to read this book. We have to read this book. And so we decided that we would read the book and it got on our list. And then we've been very lucky. We've had some authors come talk to us. And I thought, we have been loving this book so much. Maybe if I reach out to Matthew Goodman, he'll say yes and he'll come and he'll talk to us. I didn't know what would happen, and I sent him an email, and immediately he wrote back and generously said that he would come and talk to our congregation and his friends about this incredible story. If you don't know who Matthew Goodman is, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about him. He's a New York Times best-selling author of 4 books of nonfiction, The City Game, which we're talking about tonight. Its official title is The City Game, Triumph, Scandal, and a Legendary Basketball Team. And you should just know that even though it came out in hardcover in 2019, in just one more month, I think, it is coming out in paperback, and you can pre-order it now on Amazon, I'm sure, or from your local independent bookstore, which is what we would really love for you to do. 80 Days, he's also written 80 Days, Nellie Bly and Elizabeth Byland's History Making Race Around the World, The Sun, which came out in 2013, The Sun and the Moon, Hoaxers, Showmen, Dueling Journalists, and Lunar Man-Bats in 19th Century New York, and Jewish Food, The World at Table. His books have received the New York City Book Award and have been finalists for the National Jewish Book Award and the Goodreads Choice Award. They have been Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers, Indie Next Great Reads, and Borders Original Voices Selections, and have been translated into 8 languages. His writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, The American Scholar, the Harvard Review, Salon Tablet, The Forward, Bon Appetit, and many other publications. In other words, Matthew Goodman is an incredibly impressive and talented guy. He's also taught nonfiction writing at writers' conferences, including the Antioch Writers Workshop, the Cape Cod Writers Conference, and the Chautauqua Institution. He has received fellowships from the MacDowell Colony twice and the Corporation of Yaddo, whatever that is. It sounds fantastic. It has a good name. He lives what my family would call, at least half of my family would call, in the Promised Land, Brooklyn, New York, with his wife and kids. And we are so thrilled to welcome him now. I'm sure you don't want to hear anything else from me, and we definitely want to hear from you. So I'm turning things over to you now. Welcome, Matthew Goodman.
I didn't hear applause, but I saw applause, so that was very nice. Thank you. Thank you for this lovely invitation, and thank you for welcoming me literally into your homes tonight. That was a very kind introduction from Rabbi Mendelson, but I will say that she forgot one thing, which is that I grew up in Great Neck. So I am a proud graduate of Great Neck South High School, and I have very fond memories of Port Washington and spent many hours, many late nights on the Port Washington line of the Long Island Railroad. And my father was for many, many years a member of the Port Washington Tennis Academy. So my family has very many connections to Port Washington. I'm delighted to be here with you tonight. I'm also the product of an interspecies marriage. My mother was from Sunnyside, Queens, and my father was from Flatbush, Brooklyn. So, and I grew up, I was born in Queens, and now I live in Brooklyn. So it all comes full circle. So what I want to do tonight is talk a little bit about this book, The City Game. I think some of you, it sounds like some of you have read it, but I assume not all of you have read it. So I'll talk about it for maybe about half an hour, 35 minutes. Maybe a little bit longer, and then I'm happy to take as many questions as people want. I've got pretty much the rest of my life at this point. So, you know, however long you want to go is fine. So The City Game tells the story of a really remarkable basketball team, the City College Beavers of 1949-1950, which was the only team in history ever to win both postseason college basketball tournaments in the same year, meaning both the NIT and the NCAA. No team had ever done it before. No team has ever done it since. They were unique in that capacity, but they were remarkable in another way too. They were a team that comprised 8 Jewish players and 4 African American players. They were entirely what today we would call a minority team. Every member of the team was a member of they were either Jewish or Black. They were poor kids. They came from the city streets. They were a team of kind of scrappy kids from the outer boroughs. Most of them were from Brooklyn or the Bronx, white and Black, and together they achieved something that had never been achieved before or since. And what made it even more remarkable was the fact that, we're talking about 1949. This is only 2 years after Jackie Robinson had integrated Major League Baseball, at a time when the new National Basketball Association, the NBA, had not a single Black player in it. The NBA had not yet integrated. The City College team was entirely integrated, Jewish and Black players. And they were even more remarkable yet because of who they were playing for. They weren't playing for just any college. They were playing for the City College of New York, an institution that holds really a hallowed place, continues to this day, in the life of New York City. And the purpose of City College in the year 1949 was pretty much exactly what it was when that magnificent uptown campus was built in 1907, to elevate and to assimilate, to take the brightest of New York City's high school kids whose parents could not afford to send them to get a private education, and to give them an education that was comparable to perhaps any other undergraduate education in the country. To this day, I believe this is right, there are more Nobel laureates from City College than from any other institution in the world. I think that that's true. It was very hard to get in to City College. You had to pass a rigorous test. I think it was 6 hours long to get in to City College. And then you had to have a very high grade point average. City College was often referred to as Harvard on the Hudson, or the working man's Harvard, or the Harvard of the proletariat, because it was so difficult to get into. The joke around City was that when a City College student dropped out and transferred elsewhere, he raised the grade point average of both institutions by doing so. That was the sort of sentiment around City College. It was also, so in addition to being a very academic school, it was a very political school. There were these kind of famous debates in the City College cafeteria. In those days, the split wasn't between Democrats and Republicans. The split was between Stalinists and Trotskyites, in the City College cafeteria. It was a very left-wing school. So much so that another nickname for City College was the Little Red Schoolhouse. One historian called City College the longest running radical social experiment in the history of the United States. So that was another aspect of City College, and hand in hand with that, the academics and the politics. It was an overwhelmingly Jewish school, primarily Jewish, and this had been true since the early days of the 20th century. Perhaps 85 or 90% Jewish at that time. And again, this was still true in 1949, as it had been true for generations. And again, the joke around City was that CCNY stood for Circumcised Citizens of New York. That's how Jewish City College was. Other people said it stood for Christian College, now Yiddish. So depending on what you went for. So that was City. Very academic, very left-wing, very Jewish. Not an especially distinguished athletic school in no way, as exemplified by the football team of City College. The football team of City College, between the years of 1943 and 1947, the City College football team did not win a single game. And not only did it not win a single game, in the year 1944, the team didn't score a single point over the course of the entire season. So it was shut out for the season. So that gives you an idea of the athletic quality of the football team. But more than athletics, more than politics, more than academics, there was one thing that united the student body, and that was the basketball team, which was very good in comparison to the other teams at City College. The City College basketball team was quite good and extremely popular on the campus. It was coached by a guy, some of you may have heard of this name. His name was Nat Holman. Nat Holman was the head coach of City College. In fact, today at City, the gym is the Nat Holman Gymnasium. Nat Holman had been in his time, he was 53 the year that we're talking about, but in his day, he had been arguably the greatest basketball player of his time in the 1920s. He was the star player for a team called the Original Celtics, which was a very famous touring team. He was the highest paid basketball player of his time. He was one of those players who really transcend the game and become a real celebrity. You saw his picture in advertisements, in the Saturday Evening Post or Life magazine or what have you, in advertisements for Wheaties, advertisements for Ovaltine, advertisements for, the Nat Holman 60-second Vitalis hair workout was something that Nat pitched. He was really famous. And in fact, I found in the course of my research that in 1921, when he was still playing, the Converse Rubber Company of Massachusetts, as it was then known, went to Nat and offered him $50 a week if he would go around to various sporting goods and sell this new high top sneaker that this company had just invented. And Nat turned it down because he was already rich, he was already famous, he didn't need the gig. And so they gave it to another popular basketball player of the time, whose name was Chuck Taylor, who turned out to be a very good sneaker salesman, so much so that they put his name on the sneaker, the famous Chuck Taylor Converse All-Star, which could have been the Nat Holman Converse All-Star sneaker if Nat had taken the gig, which he did not do. But so he was the head coach. And we could talk more about him because he was a complicated figure. He was kind of the front man of the team, the public face of the team, but the real brains of the team, as I discovered, was the assistant coach, another Jewish guy by the name of Bobby Sand, who had also gone to City College when he was young. He was the only basketball player in the history of City College who was also a Rhodes Scholar. He spoke 5 languages. He was an economics professor at the college, and he was the one who, unbeknownst to the public, prepared the strategy for the games and sat next to Nat on the bench and whispered into his ear, Nat, I think we should take a timeout. Nat, you should take this guy out. Nat, I think we should play this kind of defense. Only loud enough for Nat to hear. And Nat, who was a very kind of pompous, vain man, never told anybody about this. And Bobby, who was a very modest, unassuming guy, also never told anybody about this. But as I discovered when I was talking to the players, and I should mention that I was fortunate enough to interview all of the surviving members of this team for this book, as well as for the ones who are no longer with us, their widows, their children, their friends, their neighbors, and so forth. Ultimately, I talked to 150 some odd people for the book. And when I spoke to these players, they all to a man said to me, my coach was Bobby Sand. He was the one who stayed after practice with me to work on my game and so forth. So he was the guy, but got very little credit. So in 1949, 50, the City team did pretty well. They were 17-5, and they were invited to the first of the postseason tournaments, which was the NIT, which was the big tournament of those days, even bigger than the NCAA. Today, the NCAA is the big tournament, but back then the NIT was really kind of the more prestigious tournament. And they played all of their games at Madison Square Garden, the old Madison Square Garden, not the direct Madison Square Garden that we have now, the old Madison Square Garden on 50th Street and 8th Avenue, which was renowned. You know, it was known as the Mecca of college basketball. And it was renowned for many things. And one of the things, some of you may remember this, the Nitix stand right in the front of the garden. It's great that I can talk to a crowd from New York. If I say Nitix, you know what I'm talking about. I did many talks around the country when I was doing the book tour for this, in places like Indianapolis, where they had no idea what Nitix was. So anyway, but there was some sort of a famous Nitix right in the front of the garden where you would get a hot dog and an orange drink before the game. And then go watch the game in the garden. So it was famous for that. And it was also famous for the smokiness inside the arena. You know, it's hard to imagine today, but it seemed like everybody was smoking inside the arena, cigarettes, cigars, you know. And it got to the point where it was so smoky up in the upper regions of the garden, which is where the City College students sat, that the sports writer Jimmy Cannon said that watching a game from up there was like looking out an airplane window when you're going through the clouds, you know, that it was just so smoky. And in fact, there was a rival coach, a guy from Rhode Island State, Frank Kearney, who used to set off smoke bombs in his home gym during practices to get his players ready to play in the garden, you know, in the atmosphere, literally the atmosphere of the garden. So they play. So City entered the NIT. It was a round. There were 4 rounds. And the first round was against the University of San Francisco, which was actually the defending national champions. City was a big underdog. They were an underdog in every game that they played in the postseason that year. They were not favored to win any of the games. They were ranked 27th in the nation, and University of San Francisco was ranked 3rd in the nation. But they managed to beat San Francisco in that game, and then they went on to now play in the quarterfinal game. And this is the game that when you talk to people who were there at that time, this is the game that everybody remembers, not the finals, but the quarterfinals, because the quarterfinal game was against the University of Kentucky. The University of Kentucky occupied a place in college basketball comparable to the place that the New York Yankees had in Major League Baseball at that time. They were the glamour team, the team that was always favored to win the tournament. They traveled around the country in a jet, which was kind of unheard of at that time. Their center was 7 feet tall, a guy named Bill Spivey, also unheard of at that time. They were ranked number 2 in the country. They had 3 members of their team were All-American first teamers. It was the only time that a team had ever had 3 first team All-Americans on one team. So they were kind of a symbol of excellence, of athletic excellence. But at the same time as they were a symbol of athletic excellence, they were a symbol of something else. And that was, they were the embodiment of Old South racism. Okay. The University of Kentucky, unlike City College, had never had a Black player on its team, and they would not have a Black player on their team for another 20 years. Not until 1970 did they integrate their basketball team, long after the other teams of the Southeastern Conference had integrated. Um, they played, of course, in Lexington, Kentucky, which was a strictly segregated city. There were no Black students among the 7,000 undergraduates of the college. The graduate program had just integrated that previous summer by force of court law. A court case had been brought by a young attorney by the name of Thurgood Marshall, had integrated the graduate program at the University of Kentucky, but the Black students had to have a different dining hall. They had to use the library at different times. And the backlash against this integration was so terrible that that summer there had been 7 cross burnings on the campus of the University of Kentucky. The coach of the University of Kentucky was a guy by the name of Adolph Rupp, who had not permitted the team to play against any Black players on Kentucky's home court. At this point, there had never been a Black player on Kentucky's home court. He had consented to let the team play against Black players on the road after World War II, because by that time the big programs were integrating, and if he wanted to participate in the postseason tournaments, he had to allow them to play against Black players. But that had only been in the past few years. And I actually found an interview that his own racial predilections were not unknown. I found an interview that he gave with a bunch of New York sports writers a few years earlier, in which he said, as I wrote in the book, he theologized, "The Lord never meant for a colored boy to play against a white boy, else he wouldn't have painted them different colors." Okay, so that was Adolph Rupp. And now this team was coming to New York, the most diverse city in the world, a city in which 25% of the population were foreign-born immigrants, including the mayor himself. William O'Dwyer was an immigrant from Ireland, to play against a team in which every member of the team was either Black or Jewish, in which the head coach and the assistant coach were both Jewish, in which the co-captains, Erwin Dambrot and Joe Gallagher, were an African-American and a Jew. Joe Gallagher was a member of the Congress of Racial Equality. He would go on to become a state senator, by the way, in the Bronx for a very long time. For a campus that was probably the most radical campus in the country. It was what today we might call a culture war. It seemed like a culture war, even more than a basketball game. And so there was a great anticipation around this game. And of course, City was the strong underdog, because as I mentioned, they were 27th in the country and Kentucky was ranked 2nd in the country, and Kentucky had won 7 postseason tournaments in the previous 4 years. I think that's right. So the game began, or the game was about to begin. It was a Tuesday night in Madison Square Garden in February, and the crowd was just abuzz. And the teams ran out onto the court, and they gathered around the center court circle. And the City College team, by the way, had 3 African-American starting members of the team. Usually it was 2, but that night it was 3. It was the first time that any college team in the postseason tournament had started 3 African-American players. And they ran out onto the court, and they gathered around the center circle, and the City College players stuck out their hands to shake hands with their Kentucky counterparts. The handshake was a long-time symbol of sportsmanship and goodwill, but this night was different, because on this night, the Kentucky players turned away. and they refused to shake hands with City College. Everyone who I spoke to who was there that night all used the same adjective to describe the moment. They said it was electric. It was electric inside the garden at that moment. Nobody could believe what they had seen. It was like a lightning bolt had just crashed down through the arena, illuminating it, but leaving a foul smell in its wake. One of the players on the team, a guy named Floyd Lane, with whom I spoke many times, told me that he turned to his pal, Ed Warner, who was another African-American player, who was an old friend of his from Harlem. And they looked at each other and they said, we're going to bust their ass. And that's what happened. The opening buzzer, horn sounded, and there was the opening jump ball, and City just took off down the court like a shot. The ball moving fast, up and back like a pinball. And City scored the first 13 points of the game. Kentucky didn't score a basket until 5 minutes had elapsed. Meanwhile, nobody in the crowd could believe what they were seeing. And people were just shouting and chanting the City College cheer, the Allagaroo, Allagaroo, Garoo, Garah, Allagaroo, Garah, and stamping their feet in unison up in the upper balconies. So vibrating so intensely that people actually worried that the balconies were going to collapse. No one could believe what they were seeing. And near the end of the game, when it was clear what the outcome was going to be, one of the City College students stood up and began to sing My Old Kentucky Home as a way to kind of bid farewell to the visiting Wildcats. And everybody stood and sung with him to serenade the Wildcats. The final score of the game was 89, City College 89, Kentucky 50. City College won by 39 points. It was the worst defeat in Adolph Rupp's long history at the University of Kentucky. The next day, this is true, the next day the Kentucky State Legislature actually considered a proposal to lower the flag at the Capitol to half-mast in mourning, but ultimately decided against that, thinking that that would add insult to injury. But the City College team became heroes as a result of this game. I spoke to one of the members of the team, another member of the team, a guy named Ron Nadell, who lives on Long Island, by the way, in Massapequa. And he told me that Nat, the coach, took the team to celebrate, took the team the next night to see South Pacific, which was the big Broadway, smash musical of that season with, I think it was Mary Martin and Ezio Pinza. And they were sitting there in the orchestra, and the public address announcer announced that they were there before the curtain went up. And everyone in the audience stood and gave them a standing ovation, on the basis of this game against Kentucky. And Ron said to me, I felt like we all could have run for president at that point. So they went on and they won the next game against Duquesne, and then the final game against the #1 ranked team in the nation from Peoria, Illinois, as a matter of fact. And they won the NIT tournament. It was the first tournament win, first championship in the history of City College. 10 days later, they entered the NCAA. They played, which was in those days only 8 teams, not 64 like today. And they won the next 3 games, and they won that tournament as well. It was the so-called Grand Slam, which no team had ever accomplished before. And suddenly they were heroes. There was a parade for them. They were greeted by, there was a photo op on the steps of City Hall with Mayor O'Dwyer. They were given the keys to the city by Manhattan Borough President Wagner. There was a huge rally for them on the campus of City College, where the bell atop the main building tolled 7 times, one for each postseason victory. It was the first time that bell had been rung in 50 years. Or 40 years, I guess. And they seemed to embody really everything that New York wanted to think about itself. They embodied racial harmony, the triumph of the outsider, the triumph of the underdog, civic virtue. They were everything that New York wanted for itself. They were called in the papers, they were referred to as our guys, our boys, our champs, and so forth. I should just mention that my book focuses a lot on a friendship among three of the members of the team, two Black players and one Jewish player, all of them remarkable in their own ways. Floyd Lane, who is the child of a single mother, grew up in the South Bronx, actually the East Bronx, on Prospect Avenue. Eddie Roman, a Jewish guy from the South Bronx, whose parents were members of the Workmen's Circle, where Yiddish was spoken in the home, where they were subscribers to the Forbits, the Yiddish daily paper. His parents supported Henry Wallace in the 1948 presidential race. They were a very progressive family. And then another guy by the name of Ed Warner, who was from Harlem. The three of them together were best friends. They used to play pickup games together. This was very unusual, of course, in 1949, 1950. And then they would go back to Floyd's house to get some lunch. And Floyd's mother, Lina was her name, would gather up Floyd's two friends in her arms, and she would say, "These are my other sons. These are my Eddies." And it was a friendship that would last a lifetime. Through Ed Warner's had a terrible car accident and he was paralyzed. He was a quadriplegic. Floyd and Eddie took turns sitting by his hospital bed, feeding him with a spoon, until Eddie Roman's tragic early death from leukemia at age 57. Floyd delivered just a beautiful eulogy for him, which I include at the end of the book. They were friends right up till the very end. So anyway, just to finish things up, I'll skip ahead to the following season. It's now a year later. The team hasn't been playing especially well this year. They're hoping to get into the postseason. And one night, they're coming back on a train from Philadelphia, where they had played a game against Temple University. It's 1:30 in the morning. They're coming back into the old Penn Station on a drizzly, cold January night, or I guess it was February night. And when they get off the train, they're met by 4 detectives from the District Attorney's Office of New York. And 5 members of the team are arrested and charged with conspiring with gamblers to shave points. They're brought downtown to the District Attorney's Office. They're interrogated through the night. They're not allowed to call their parents. They're not allowed to seek legal advice. Nat Holman kind of left them out hanging on their own. Nat didn't call lawyers for them, didn't call their parents or anything like that. Finally, after hours of interrogation, hungry, tired, confused, they confessed that they had taken money in 3 games that year to shave points. Now, what does that mean, shave points? It doesn't mean that they were trying to lose a game. It means that they were trying to control the score of the game. The point spread is the number of points that a consortium of bookmakers had decided that City College was favored to win by. So let's say that they were favored to win by 9 points. If you bet the under, even if City won by 5 points, 6 points, 7 points, 8 points, you would still win. City could still win the game, but you would still win as long as they won by fewer than 9 points or whatever the point spread happened to be. So by shaving points, they were trying to win the game and bring the game, the final margin under whatever the point spread was. How prevalent was sports bookmaking in New York City at that time? Well, there were about 4,000 sports bookmakers in New York City. It was estimated that $300,000 were being bet on every college basketball game in Madison Square Garden that was played at that time. One of, if not the most powerful bookmaker of that time, who becomes a major figure in my book, was a guy by the name of Harry Gross, who is a Brooklyn bookmaker. He was taking in $20 million a year in sports bets, which seems like a lot of money, which is a lot of money, but it's even more money when you realize that in today's currency, that's over $200 million a year he was taking in sports betting. How prevalent, by the way, was bookmaking? The point spreads were published in the newspapers. You could pick up a copy of the New York Post and they had the lines printed in the sports section of this felonious activity, okay? Harry Gross was taking in all of this money and was protecting himself by laying out $1 million a year in what he called ICE, bribe money, shelling out money to New York City police and politicians to protect himself from his industry, from his business getting shut down. Ultimately, it came to be discovered that the mayor had received money from Harry Gross and the police commissioner had received money from Harry Gross. And in fact, that same year of the City College scandal, both the police commissioner and the mayor resigned in bookmaking scandals that same year, okay? So the players confessed to doing this. They went overnight, literally overnight, from being heroes to villains. The sense of shock and betrayal that existed on the College of City campus, the campus of City College, was incredible. One of the people I spoke to who was a student there at the time told me that it was a sense of collective grief that he did not feel again until the assassination of President Kennedy. That's the sense of, as high up on the pedestal as they had been put, that's how hard they fell. They were thrown out of college. They were banned from basketball for life. None of them ever was allowed to play in the NBA, and several of them would have surely been good enough to play in the NBA. Two of them, I should mention that ultimately the scandal spread beyond City College to 7 schools in both New York and around the country. There were 5 great college basketball programs in New York, City College, of course, NYU, Manhattan College, who am I forgetting? St. John's, and Long Island University, which is based in Brooklyn. 4 of those colleges ended up having players who were caught up in this scandal. So 2 of them, one of them from City College, Ed Warner, and one from Long Island University, Sherman White, actually went to jail. They actually went to jail for this. They were the first athletes to go to jail for gambling-related offenses. Even the Black Sox of 1919, who had tried to lose games, who did lose games intentionally, had not gone to jail. And by the way, both Ed Warner and Sherman White were the 2 best players on each of their teams. Sherman White was about to be drafted by the New York Knicks in the draft, and Ed Warner was supposedly going to be drafted by the Boston Celtics, but their careers were upended by this, and both of them were Black. And it was not a coincidence that both of these guys, who were talented, outspoken, confident young Black men, were put in jail when others were not put in jail. And in the book, I analyze the judge's decision that makes it very clear that there was a racial undertone in his reasoning about why he made the decisions that he did, referring to things about how they had, they were arrogant, and they were, taking young women to nightclubs and so forth, the kind of language that was not spoken of young white men, and indeed was not spoken about young white men. It was spoken about these two young Black men who both went to prison. Um, just to finish up, I'll mention that, as I said, there were 5 great basketball programs in New York at that time, but only 4 of them had players who ultimately got implicated in this scandal. One of them skated away scot-free, and that was St. John's University, a Catholic university based in Queens. And as I discuss in the book at some length, there is very good reason to believe that St. John's was also implicated in the sports bookmaking scandal, but was protected by a police force that was overwhelmingly Irish Catholic and supportive of St. John's, including the police commissioner himself, William Patrick O'Brien, who was very close friends with the coach of St. John's, who was referred to in the newspapers as the #1 St. John's fan in the city, and often sat behind the St. John's bench during games at Madison Square Garden. There were also rumors that there had been an intervention by the very powerful Cardinal of New York at that time, a guy by the name of Cardinal Spellman, Francis Cardinal Spellman, a very powerful, very right-wing, very political, kind of almost like medieval type pope, pulling strings behind the scenes, that he had intervened with the district attorney, Frank Hogan, and had promised him campaign funds for his race for the governorship in 2 years. But you can't touch our boys. You can't touch our boys. And so the rumor around New York was that St. John's had been saved by, quote, divine intervention. So St. John's to this day is a Division I top flight basketball school, the only one of all of these colleges that is so, because the other colleges had their programs removed or sharply reduced in the wake of this scandal, but not St. John's, which continues, as I said, to this day. The last thing I'll say is just talk about this one guy, Floyd Lane, who's really, in a way, kind of the hero of my book. He's an amazing person. He's now 87 years old, still was coaching high school basketball in Manhattan up until just a few years ago. Floyd was a very good kid who had tried to resist taking money, had said no on 2 separate occasions before he finally agreed to do it, because he realized that all of the other members of the team were also going to be doing it. He took $3,000. He took it, he wrapped it up in a handkerchief and put it in a flower pot in his bedroom so his mother, a single mother, would not find it, and only spent 110 of it to buy her a washing machine for Christmas, because she had never had a washing machine. She was a domestic worker and had washed other people's clothing, but had never had a washing machine of her own. But he was arrested along with everybody else and thrown out of college and banned for life from the NBA. He spent years trying to get into the NBA, trying to get a tryout for an NBA team, but was always denied. He said to me, "I felt that just 10 minutes on the court could have changed the course of my life." But he was never permitted to. So finally, by the 1960s, he had given up his hope of playing in the NBA. He had a great love of kids, and he went into working with kids in youth centers in the South Bronx, all through the worst days of New York's fiscal crisis, the 60s and the 70s. He was working in the poorest neighborhoods in New York, working with kids to get off of drugs, get out of gangs, get into college. He helped at least 400 kids, by one estimate, get into college. Some people say it was more than that. He found scholarship money for kids to get into college, money for books, money for tuition, and so forth. He mentored innumerable kids. One of them, a young player by the name of Tiny. He was known as Tiny around the neighborhood. We know him as Nate Tiny Archibald, who would go on to become a Hall of Fame NBA player. Floyd was never allowed to play in the NBA, but his protege, Nate Archibald did. Um, Floyd was really an amazing guy. And amazingly enough, in 1975, the position of head basketball coach at City College came open, and Floyd applied for the job. And amazingly, Floyd got the job and became head basketball coach at City College. 25 years earlier, he had been escorted off of the campus by 2 detectives. Now he was returning as the head coach at City College. And it was my great pleasure to be able to launch this book at City College, in the Great Hall of City College, where I was introduced by the president of the college. And I was delighted that Floyd was there that night and participated with me in the question and answer period, and was able to really speak about his life. And it was a really moving experience for, I think, everybody who was there, including all of the members of the current edition of the City College basketball team, who were all gathering around Floyd to have him sign their books. It was a very moving experience. So I think I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions if people have them.
So thank you so much. We'll give you a chance to also catch your breath. If you have a question and you want to raise your hand or make a comment in the chat box, I'm going to turn this over first. Jerry Federline, do you want to say something? I'm going to turn it to you first.
Okay. Unmute, Jerry. It truly is a wonderful book on so many different levels. It's a wonderful period piece about life in post-war New York City. A great character study. I was 8 years old when they won, so I was too busy playing stickball and handball games in the streets of Shakespeare Avenue in Southwest Bronx, with not a blade of grass anywhere nearby. And I particularly found the ending chapters so emotional. I felt like I was being drawn in, almost being part of the family. That's how moving it was. It was also very heartening, as you said, that Floyd Lane and Bobby Sands were eventually brought back into the City College family. That was, very heartening to see that, to read about that. And I also found it very moving, your few pages devoted to Jackie Robinson coming in to talk to the team just prior to the final of the NCAA tournament. That was a very, very moving piece. I do have 2 questions for you. One is, in your research, which was truly remarkable, did you come across the scandals a decade later, this 1960-61 scandal, the point shaving scandals? When it comes to sports betting, history has always had a sense of repetition, history repeating itself. And that's when I became aware of the history of scandals, because that was the year I went to Van Buren High School in 1960. That was the year my school came in 4th. But the two products of the system, Connie Hawkins and Roger Brown, 2 arguably among the finest basketball players ever produced in New York City, their names were implicated in the scandals then, and they were not allowed to play even in college. And I'm just wondering if you came across that particular episode in your research. And then I also have a very specific question, and that is, one of your sources was a man by the name of Jerry Domashik, who was my broker for a while, and I'm always curious what his involvement was. How did you come across him?
Oh, just very quickly, Jerry, super guy, lives down in Florida now. He was a captain of a later a later team. So he spoke to me about Nat Holman and about Bobby Sand and City College, but he was not implicated in the scandal at all. Let me just say a couple of things about your comments. First, about Jackie Robinson, very quickly. I interviewed Floyd on several occasions. And, you're talking about events that happened like 65 years earlier, when people are really quite young and they don't really remember that much, or it's hard for them to remember, or they're sort of leery about talking about some of this. Some of it is a little bit painful, to remember some of this stuff. But I was talking to Floyd about the second championship game, and I said to him, you were on the verge of history on this game. Did anything interesting happen before the game? Because you knew that there was this sort of amazing thing that was going to happen. And he said, well, I think maybe that was the night that Jackie Robinson came to speak to us. And my head just kind of shot up. I said, what? Because I had never heard anything about this. He said, yeah, Jackie came in to give us a little pep talk before the game. I said, you're kidding. I said, what did he say? He said, oh, I don't remember. I said, Floyd, you better remember, because I can't put it in the book if you don't remember, So he sort of, began to piece together what he had said. But I needed confirmation of this. So I went back to Ron Nadell, who I had already spoken to, who was another member of the team. And I said, Ron, Floyd mentioned that somebody spoke to you guys before the second Bradley game. Do you remember that? And he said, oh, you mean when Jackie Robinson came and spoke to us? I said, why didn't you tell me about that the first time I spoke to you? He said, I don't know. I didn't really think about it, So anyway, that was one of my favorite moments, as you indicated. That was one of my favorite moments in the book, was being able to write about Jackie Robinson, who was such an important person in so many ways. To answer your other question, I did find out about some information about the second scandal. I didn't go into it in the book because it was sort of beyond the purview of the book. That was a scandal that centered around a guy by the name of, what's his name? I'm forgetting his name now.
Molinas?
Jack Molina, thank you. Jack Molinas, who was from the Bronx. And the bookmaker who was involved with that was a guy by the name of Joe Jalop, who was also implicated in this scandal as well. So there was a connection there. And St. John's, by the way, was implicated in that scandal, along with Columbia and some other local colleges. Now, you mentioned Connie Hawkins and Roger Brown. They were like the City College guys. They were these kind of young guys who were very talented, somewhat naive. They didn't really understand what was going on, and they were being given money by Jack Molinas. And they ended up getting banned from the NBA for many years. And it took Connie Hawkins, who was arguably the greatest player of his time, or one of the greatest players, offensive players anyway, of his time. He had to sue the NBA to be allowed to play in the NBA, and he ultimately won his case, and he was allowed to play in the NBA. When my book came out, the Wall Street Journal asked me to write an article giving my 5 best books about sports scandals, and one that I was sure to include was a book called Foul, which was about Connie Hawkins and the Connie Hawkins scandal. It's a very beautiful book.
Thank you.
I know, Michael Cooperman, you have your hand raised, or maybe it's Roberta, I'm not sure. And then
No,
I see Marty.
it's
Michael.
It's me. So,
Okay, Michael.
Matt, I too enjoyed the book tremendously. I'm an ex-Bronxite. I went to Taft High School, so it was really highly unusual to see the mention of Taft High School.
The Taft president says the team was known.
But my basic question is, why did you write it? Why did this spark tremendous interest in you to spend as much time and energy and be able to put such a beautiful book together. And it was quite moving to read, and the lack of fairness in our country at that time was really very moving. And so my basic question is, why did you write it?
Right, thank you. And thank you for those kind words. You know, financial desperation is always a very good motivator, you know, for one thing. No, I mean, you know, I write what I refer to as narrative history, which is history that's told in kind of a novelistic way. And to write that kind of book, you need to have a lot of different criteria that are met. You know, you have to have great characters. You have to have a narrative arc to the story. You know, the rising action and a falling action, a climactic moment. You know, for me, I like there to be a political element to the story because I'm very interested in politics, in history. And it has to be something that's commercial enough that, you know, a publisher is going to pay you, you know, for your time to write the book, that they think that they're going to make a profit on that book. And it has to be a story that hasn't been told before or not told in this particular way. And it's hard to find a story that meets all of those various criteria. And it took me, it took me about 18 months of searching to, you know, to find this particular story. Really what happened was after about 18 months, I had basically given up on anything. And I just, you know, I was so demoralized. I had been at the New York Public Library on 42nd Street all day looking for things. And I hadn't found anything. And I returned the books to the librarian and I came home and I was so demoralized. And I thought, all the good ideas have been taken. What am I going to do? And literally walking home from the subway to my house, I passed a bus stop. And on the side of the bus stop was an ad for New York Knicks season tickets, okay? Because the Knicks are so horrible that they have to advertise, you know, for season tickets. So I thought I should write a basketball book because, you know, I like basketball, and even more to the point, there haven't been a lot of great basketball books that have been written, certainly compared to baseball books. You know, there haven't been that many good basketball books. So I was thinking, but what story would I want to tell? And here's the key to the story. My father went to City College a few years after this, in the mid-50s, just for a couple of years, and then he transferred to Brooklyn College. And when I was a kid, I had sort of vaguely heard the story of a, you know, legendary basketball team that had gotten caught up in some sort of scandal. I didn't know what. And that appealed to me because I thought, okay, this is a New York story. I like to write New York stories. There's a racial element to it. There's a triumph, there's a scandal, and it has a political element to it as well. And, you know, by the time I got the 3 blocks home to my house, I thought, this is the idea. You know, I kind of had fallen in love with the idea right away. And then I had to just go, you know, to Google and make sure that nobody else had written, you know, this particular book that I was thinking about. And nobody had written about it since the early 70s. So I felt like the path was pretty clear. And I spent just a few days researching it, and I went in and to my agent's office. This was in the days when you could go into the office and, you know, talk to somebody face to face. And he's a Jewish guy from the Upper West Side in his 60s. And I was telling him the story, and I told him the story of the Kentucky game, and he goes, I see the movie. This is great, you know. And then I went in and pitched it to my editor, and she loved it. And so, you know, that was the story. That's how it happened.
It's very interesting. It's also, I'll just note to you that I spent 19 years with ICM, the Talent and Literary Agency. So I can commiserate with going in to talk to your agent.
Yeah, thank you.
Matthew, what happened to the coach, to Nat Holman?
Right. Well, this is another interesting part of the story. That's a great question. Nat Holman, who was, as I said, kind of the public face of the team, who was a kind of a vain guy, narcissistic, really, who came from the Lower East Side of New York, but managed to speak with he sounded like Franklin Roosevelt. He spoke with an upper class. His players called it a British accent. It wasn't really a British accent. It was like a boarding school kind of accent that he had sort of taught himself to speak. His brother Jack used to say, I don't know where he got that phony accent. I grew up in the same neighborhood he did, you know. You know, that was kind of the way he was, and he dressed in, you know, Saks Fifth Avenue suits and so forth. And basically what happened was that Nat kept his job, and he maintained his position as head coach at City College until his retirement in the early 1960s, and was subsequently voted into the National Basketball Hall of Fame. So he's in the Hall of Fame himself in Springfield, Massachusetts. His assistant coach, Bobby Sand, who, as I mentioned earlier, was really the brains of the team, took the fall. He was a very menschy guy, but he was the one who got fired. He lost his job, and he was banned from teaching. He was a wonderful economics professor, and he was not allowed to teach again for 15 years, and only got his job back when he sued New York State in order to get his job back, and he finally did. And then in 1970, he was declared City College Teacher of the Year. You know, some justice had been done there, but it was justice long delayed in the case of Bobby Sand. You know, it was a pretty typical case of, you know, the bottom man on the totem pole ends up taking the fall for everyone above him.
Hi, I'm Dr. Charlene Berkman. I was Erwin Dambrot's associate and partner for 8 years.
Yes.
And I want to know how you fit Erwin into the story. I have not read your book yet, but I know that the guys met all these bookies up in the Catskills.
Yes.
And that was a very big part of
Exactly.
how they were wined and dined. And
yes, I'm glad you mentioned that. Erwin was you know, unfortunately he passed away before I could talk to him. I spoke to his widow, Katrina. He was by all accounts a wonderful man, you know, and a great dentist. He was, I believe, the only person in the history of the NBA to turn down a first round. He was chosen in the first round by the New York Knicks and turned them down to go to dental school.
Well, he was actually banned from playing basketball that year, and he played with the Generals, you know, the Harlem Globetrotters team for a year before he was not allowed to go to dental school for a year.
Okay.
And then he went
is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he played with the Harlem Globetrotters Generals.
Erwin is a complicated guy. You know, they all had different reasons for why they did what they did. And really a big part of what I'm trying to do in the book is not to condone what these guys did. You know, the guys themselves feel bad about it, you know, and came to feel bad about it in later years. Erwin especially, by the way. He always referred to it as a shanda, you know, that he had participated in this. But he only did it in one game and then felt so horrible about it, he pulled out. After that, he only did it once.
He always said that the guys couldn't trust him not to tell, so they wouldn't tell him what was going on.
Okay, well that's probably right. You know, it's a funny story. Well, I won't tell it now, but it's a funny story about what he did in that game. But they all had different reasons for doing what they did. You know, there were some guys who were kind of entrepreneurial about it, you know, who basically their attitude was, everybody is getting rich off this game except for me. You know, the promoter of this amateur game, Ned Irish, is living in a 12-room apartment on Park Avenue and making $150,000 a year when he started out as a sports writer making $47 a week before he started promoting this, quote, amateur game. You know, everybody in the Garden on a basketball night, except for the spectators who paid to get in, the promoter, the coaches, the bookmakers, the sports writers, the ushers, everybody is making money except for the players whose talent is making it all possible. So, some of them felt like, I deserve some compensation. So that was their attitude. But more of them were doing it because they were poor and they had a lot of financial difficulties. Ed Roman used to watch his parents sit at the kitchen table every night, just not knowing how they were going to pay the mortgage. And he hoped that someday, when this was all over, he was going to be able to hand the money to his mother. He didn't spend a single dollar of the money that he received. As I was saying, what I was trying to do with this book is to provide a more complex understanding of the motivations of these guys. They were treated as cliches in the headlines of the newspapers, that they were immoral, they were corrupt, they were bad guys willing to sell out their college, sell out their city for a quick buck. But the reality was far more complicated than that. The reality was that there were these young guys, 18, 19 years old, who got caught up in a vast web of corruption involving all the strata of New York City, the police, the politicians, the church, the colleges themselves, and they ended up getting caught as a result of this. And I'm sort of implicitly asking the reader to ask herself or himself, what might you have done if you were in that situation? It's very easy to say, oh, I would be pure, I wouldn't take that money. And maybe that's true. Some of them didn't take the money. But if you were a poor kid and somebody's offering you $1,000, which is way more money than you've ever seen before, and you think you might be able to help pay off your parents' mortgage, and you know that this has been going on for a long time because you grew up in the schoolyards and you were talking to the college kids back then, and they were telling you that they were doing it and nobody ever got caught. And by the way, you're not trying to lose the game. You're just trying to alter the score of the game, which is the score that nobody's going to remember in a week anyway. And you know that the cop on the corner is taking money from bookmakers. The cop on the corner is doing it. If you were in that situation, it might not be so easy to say no. You might just say yes, So I'm asking the reader to kind of interrogate yourself about how you might have acted and to open a little bit more of a sense of empathy about what these guys did. And in terms of Irwin, it was very complicated why Irwin did what he did. And really the reason that Irwin did what he did was because he wanted to be popular. He wanted to be well-liked by the other guys on the team. Irwin was this sort of fantastically handsome guy who had Edie Gourmet was, was his high school classmate, and she had a big crush on him, in high school. And all the girls wanted Irwin, and they, he was, well built, but he was an insecure guy. And he didn't want to say no to the other guys because he was afraid of letting them down. And he wanted to be a guy, the sports writer Jerry Eisenberg said to me, Irwin Dambrot wanted to be a street corner guy. He wanted to be a guy hanging out on the street corner, talking to, hanging out with the other guys, but he had no one to hang out with. And so that's what he was trying to do. And that's why he took the money in the first game. But then he felt so horrible about it that he never did it. He never did it again. But he got lumped in. He got lumped in it, with everybody else.
Yeah, he was a very good guy. He really was very honorable, and he was very smart. He was sort of like the Bill Bradley smart.
Yes.
So he was kind of a nerd.
Well, he went to I think he went to Columbia, maybe Columbia.
Yes, went to Columbia Dental School.
I want to be cognizant of the time. I know that there are a few more questions. So Marty Farber, I want to give you a chance to ask your question or make your comment.
Yeah, mostly comments, not questions. Matthew, I finished reading your book last night, and I didn't read it for the basketball aspect, but for the fact that I went to City. I entered City College in 1952 when it was all over. But reading your book, it was more interesting to me, not for the basketball plays, which I'm not interested in, but the college itself. At the beginning of the book, you described the construction of it, and architecture is one of my interests. that the college sort of grew out of the ground of Manhattan because it was made from stones of Manhattan. I found that fascinating. And you also had me when you mentioned Raymond the Bagel Man.
Oh yeah.
He sustained a lot of people. I remember the price; they were 10 cents each, 3 for a quarter. And he brought back so many memories with the Great Hall and rubbing Lincoln's nose and the difficulty of getting in, which was very difficult. You needed scores in the stratosphere, or you took a test. I remember that 6-hour test very well with a break for lunch. And fortunately, I did get in, and it was a great experience. But there was very little talk of the scandal by 1952. I remember Nat Holman being mentioned several times as being a very good guy. But other than that, most people were by 52 into their studies.
Yeah. Well, you know, thank you for your kind words. And I did love writing about the architecture of the city, but you know, the scandal was really kind of hushed up for a long time at City College in the subsequent decades. And I have to say, I was nervous about how my book was going to be treated at City College. Because, you know, it brought up some painful memories. And I was delighted to, you know, by how welcoming the administration of City College was to me. And, you know, the president was nice enough to say at the introduction at my book launch that this was the book they'd been waiting for decades, you know, that it sort of was an opening for them to you know, discuss their own history, really. So that was great. And I did a talk with other members of the City College community at the Center for Jewish History last year when they did a whole week-long symposium, or maybe it was a month-long symposium about City College.
It wasn't just a book about basketball, it was a book about people.
Yeah.
And how they behave.
That's
I think whether you're interested in baseball, in basketball or not, I think the book is fascinating just from that aspect. As you said, what would you have done?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious, how many people here went to City College, have a relative who went to City College, or went to a college in New York City, like went to a city school, like Brooklyn College, Long Island University? How many people on this call? Yeah. So I'm just wondering, just to see a show of hands. So for you, this story resonated and brought back some powerful memories, I'm guessing. Yeah. And, you know, I think that, you know, I will speak on, unless there's somebody else who wants to go, I'll speak on behalf of some of us who, Marcia, you want to talk instead of me? That's good. I'll turn it to you.
No, she's closing. She's wrapping up.
Oh,
No, it's okay. Marcia, you go, and then I'm going to close after you.
okay, question.
Yeah, well,
Okay,
actually,
sure.
I just, yeah, well, one observation, one thing that really struck me is Adolph Rupp took his team to see South Pacific.
Right.
A musical about racism, which I guess didn't take.
I know, that's so ironic. I know it's a play about having to be taught to hate. And he did take his team to see South Pacific. I know that's a very good observation. Yeah.
But I'm interested because, you know, I mean, college basketball seems to be a history of doing the same thing and expecting a different result in terms of, I mean, John Thompson called it a plantation, you know, modern plantation. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are. And, you know, because, I mean, one of the attractions of college basketball is sort of the youth and the innocence and the amateur. But on the other hand, these kids are getting screwed. So, you know, what do you see for the future of college basketball?
You know, to me, one of the great quotes in the book is from 1951. One of the editors of the left-wing paper in the city at that time, the name of which is escaping me at the moment, was it the Compass? I can't remember now, but said, there are no amateurs in big-time college basketball. There are only underpaid professionals. And I thought that was very, very prescient to be writing that in 1951. You know, all of the conditions that existed in 1950 to allow for this point shaving scandal are still true in college basketball today, and in fact are far worse today than they were in 1950. I wrote a piece in USA Today about this very topic. Nat Holman, the great Nat Holman, was being paid the equivalent of $95,000 a year to coach City College, one of the top teams in the country. Today, John Calipari at the University of Kentucky is being paid $7 million a year in salary. Mike Krzyzewski at Duke is making $7 million a year in salary. You have 69 Division I college basketball coaches that are making more than $1 million a year in salary. I believe every state in the country, or almost every state in the country, the highest paid municipal employee in the state is a sports coach in that state. You have the NCAA signed a contract with CBS for $8.8 billion to cover the NCAA March Madness tournament. The amount of money that is coursing through the game today is jaw-dropping, right? And far more than it was in 1950. And the disjunction is far greater today than it even was back then between the amount of money flowing through the game and the fact that these guys can't partake of any of it themselves. And as long as you have that kind of situation, you're always going to have a situation that's rife for corruption. When you think about it, you have a situation that's almost unique in American society. You have a group of young men, supremely talented, unusually talented, but whose talents can earn enormous profits, but only for other people. They cannot partake of any of that money themselves. That's a situation that's really unique in American society, where you're talented, you can earn a lot of money, but only for other people, not for yourself. And as long as that situation exists, there's always going to be the temptation to try to take some of that for yourself. So I'm always asked when I do these talks, do you think that this is going on today? I have no way of knowing if it's going on today or not. But, people thought it had ended in 1951, and then it came back in 1961, and then 1975, and then, at Boston College, and then in the 80s in Arizona, and in the 90s in Louisiana. So I would not be surprised if something like this were not going on today in college basketball.
So obviously this is a book that, it gives, one of the things that's, is so amazing about your book is the incredible amount of detail in it. And yet for as much detail as it's in there, and for as many questions as you answer, really, what you give us is a lot of things to think about. So many questions are raised by this book, including what's already been said, what would you do? And what Mark just asked now about, where are we today with this very same issue? And, it's very difficult, I think, to see so many people making money off the backs of these young players who, are put in impossible situations. Some of the other things that came up in an earlier conversation about the book, and I hear my kid coming in, I'm just going to ask him to be quiet, is also just, the idea that these were, at the time, in 1949, 1950, these were kids who, whose parents were immigrants, or whose, who were just, again, like money was really an issue for all these families. And the truth is, City College continues to serve a very similar constituency. Yes. And do the holy work of giving an education, to the same kinds of kids that some of the people on this call were at the time that they were in school.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
which is a really incredible service to our city, to the great city of New York, and to its residents, and frankly, to our country. It also, I think, allowed so many people who, it allows so many of us to reminisce about, the city in a different time and remember the neighborhoods that we grew up in. And Jerry, started off talking about, remembering playing stickball with his friends in the streets of, Shakespeare Avenue in the Bronx. And, I know there are some Bronx boys on this call, including my own dad, who have great memories of the Bronx and, and their childhood there, and, remember the very same thing. And the conversations, continue. I know there are probably people representing every one of the boroughs of New York, except maybe, is there anyone from Staten Island here tonight? Staten Island is the hardest to, Joe Levinson. But, and I'm sure that many of you also remember the bookies of that time period, and people placing bets. I'm looking at my mom shaking her head because her family was filled with them. And I say lovingly, but that being said, I just want to say on behalf of all of us here, we could keep talking about this because, like I said, you've given us, you've taught us so much from this book, and you've made us think about a lot because of this book. If you haven't read it yet, I want to just remind you that the City Game will be available in paperback in 1 month from now. You can pre-order it on Amazon. Although you can also pre-order it from your local independent bookstore, which would be our first choice for you. And I hope if you haven't read it, I can't imagine that you don't want to read it now. And it's a great gift for friends. We're looking forward to your next book. Would you just tell us a little bit about what you're writing next? And then we're going to take the night.
Well, very quickly, it's a book with the same publishing house and the same editor, I'm happy to say, and it's about two older women, one an American, a Jewish woman from New York, and an English woman who are both living in Paris in 1940, who end up getting involved in a plan to save scores of British servicemen trapped behind enemy lines, behind Nazi lines in occupied France. And they succeed in saving many, many soldiers, some of whom they carried to safety in the trunk of their car, actually driving them out of occupied Paris. So that's the working title is The Paris Line, and that's the next book. But I take far too long to write these things, so it'll be a while.
Well, I can only imagine because, I think, one of the things that struck me and so many other folks that I've talked to about the book is the unbelievable amount of detail. And clearly, I think I heard you say you spoke to over 150 people. Did you say? I don't even know. I interviewed so many people for this book, and it just showed. So on behalf of all of us, I want to say thank you so much for the gift of this book and the gift of your time.
Thank you.
We've really been looking forward to this night, and it did not disappoint.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. This is my dream audience. What can I say?
I mean, as it should be, frankly. Friends, great to see you. Stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Good night, everyone.
Night.